Greetings. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability.
I'm Ingrid Ackermann, a junior at Stanford studying environmental systems engineering.
And we have with us here today Professor Amit Seru from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. We're just coming off of a conference on finance and environmental sustainability that Professor Paul Fleiterer and Professor Amit Seru chaired. Thank you so much for coming, Amit.
Thank you, Bill and Ingrid, for having me.
And so coming out of the conference, Amit, my biggest question for you is, what is the most important takeaway, or some of them, from today?
So I think it was interesting. Over the 2 days, we had lots of agreements and lots of disagreements, which is a hallmark of a good conference, I would say. There was some controversy around whether things can be measured and magnitudes related to climate risk and how much investors value this risk and what kind of returns they would be interested in having if they wanted to make the change towards environmental sustainability. But it's fair to say that one common theme that emerged was that there might be some concerned investors who might have a role to play in the future. But the government will have to play a much bigger role. And that was, I think, the takeaway for me, that if you look at the amount of risk that climate change imposes, clearly the benefits of avoiding that far exceed the costs if you do the calculations in different ways. And the question is, why is this not happening? And the answer that many folks settled down with was that there are governments, and different governments have different costs and benefits. They don't look at the world as a whole. And then the question is, how are we going to make sure that governments as a whole internalize all the costs and benefits of climate risk and climate change? And while finance and the investors in the financial sector, especially the concerned ones, might have a role to play, they will not be as central as governments coordinating together and coming to a consensus on how to do things. So, for example, there was a lot of conversation about India and China going on a certain path, which was totally understandable given where they are in the life cycle of things relative to developed economies in the West. And the big question then is, how do you incentivize India and China to do the kind of things that developing countries are now doing, while making sure that the growth that is potentially useful for their population doesn't get inhibited as well?
Oh, that's interesting. So step back for a minute, if you could, Amit. Our listeners include a wide variety of people, and there'll be folks who have backgrounds that are very rich, but often without any finance. And why think of in that broad perspective, why does it make sense for people who study finance to be talking about sustainability?
So yeah, Bill, that's a great question. If you scan the news these days, one of the things you see frequently discussed is, how should the money that all of us have in our retirement funds get invested? So that's something that I think everybody can understand. We have retirement savings and we invest in certain kinds of funds. And traditionally, the adage has been, invest in funds which give you the highest return for the least amount of risk. And the common adage in the industry is, go for the market index, S&P 500 in the US and so on. And increasingly, lots of investors have expressed the view that they actually are passionate about different environment, governance, and societal goals that they want to pursue and have the funds pursue. And if they do pursue that, then the question is, can they still achieve the same amount of returns for the minimal amount of risk? Because that's deviating from what the market index might be. So there has been a raging debate on this, right from which funds are actually going to be pursuing these ESG goals to how much the investors are willing to give up. So for a common person who doesn't understand finance, they need to know that Vanguards and Fidelities and BlackRocks of the world, where their money might be invested either directly or through their pension funds or through the endowments, they are facing the same conundrum that can they accentuate the change on climate? And in return, maybe the investors are willing to take a little bit of a lower return because they are giving this up because they actually want to make a difference. So it affects everyone in that way.
And coming off of that, in the news, we're overwhelmingly seeing more and more about ESG. What in this conference was clarified or uncovered in that space for you?
ESG, just for folks who don't know.
Is environment, social, and governance a key part of many firms that is, I guess, growing in the current day?
So I think there was a lot of discussion on ESG, as you can imagine. One set of discussions were, can we actually measure what components go under E, S, and G? And you can imagine environment has many components. What do we think Google's E score is, or a S score is, or a G score is? Because each of these things have many dimensions. So on E, you have climate, carbon footprint in different ways. On the S front, you have things like how much is the board really diverse, and so on. And on the G front is the governance that the firm has. And one issue that was discussed quite a bit was, can we measure these things appropriately? And the answer is kind of, but maybe not, because these measures are difficult to come down to have agreements on. They are easily manipulated and so on. But leaving the measurement aside, I think what was interesting was to see, like, if we could measure these things precisely, would all investors agree what they felt was the appropriate E, S, or G thing from their side? And the answer that we saw in the conference was not really, because there's a huge amount of heterogeneity. Also, there is a huge amount of heterogeneity in terms of how much different investors are willing to give up to pursue these different ESG goals. So altogether, that just tells you that it's a topic that is discussed quite a bit, and you are already seeing in the news Vanguards of the world and BlackRocks of the world offering these different ESG funds to cater to different investors. But there is a lot of confusion in terms of how to measure and how to then cater to different investors. And hopefully, by the time we have this conference in another year, we'll have some more clarity.
And so based on all of that takeaways from ESG, we spent a lot of time at the conference talking about its value, whether or not it's simply a distraction from focusing on more of the solutions that will actually push the needle forward. What did you grasp from those conversations?
I felt that, like, we have moved forward from where this literature, academic as well as practitioner discussions on ESG were a few years back. At least there is clarity on the things that we all disagree on. Mm-hmm. So there is disagreement on which ESG measure is going to be the thing. And I think what the participants came out from the conference was that maybe we'll have to live with these different measures being different. But that doesn't mean you got to stop there. You got to just see what appeals to a certain kind of investor and then go from there. Because for a long time, academics and policymakers have been stuck on the precise measure of ESG, which supposedly will be what everybody will use. And I think it's fair to say that that's not going to happen. But the other thing which I thought was very useful was to see that everybody appreciates that there is going to be heterogeneity in how different investors are going to be thinking about this problem. And then the question is, given that, what should policymakers do? What should large investment funds do? What should endowments do? What should pension funds do? And what should corporate boards do? Because a lot of board members of CalPERS and CalSTRS, the large pension funds, are advised to follow the usual adage of maximizing returns while not focusing on ESG. And we at least reached the agreement that if we want investors to have a big role to play in this, then we'll have to think a little bit more carefully about what the fiduciary duty of the board members and the management needs to be. So I think that's progress, because at least we now know and agree that that's something that we'll have to focus on. Whether we get there or not remains to be seen, because policymakers and everybody has to get on board.
Well, that's interesting. There were some big controversies over the 2 days, and if you could just, Amit, what do you think was the biggest controversy that you take away from the conference?
I think the biggest controversy was some participants thinking that finance and investors have a big role to play potentially in accentuating this change, versus lots of folks thinking that actually government has a much bigger role. And investors, while important, are still a sideshow in this whole scheme of things. And if you asked me which side I sort of landed on, I think I would say I landed on the latter, which is, yes, we all understand now that there are big gains and costs potentially, because we are going to from the current world to a world and transitioning to a world which will look different, safer maybe on climate dimensions, but it'll require costs, and then we'll have huge benefits. We kind of understand that, but you cannot avoid the fact that governments have to play a role, and the costs and benefits fall unequally on different parts of the world. And how we get there is going to be extremely important. So to the extent that we've had a political economy and sustainability conference already, I heard the podcast, Bill, where one of the themes that came out again in that was that political economy is important. And I think you're seeing that same theme emerge here. And the controversy was around that, but I think it's the right answer that we got in the end, I think, at the end of the day.
Well, Ingrid, you were here for the conference, and I want to put you on the spot. What, as you come away, what's your big takeaway from this couple of days as the voice of the next generation?
Oh, I think one of my big takeaways before this conference was I was a bit more skeptical about ESG in general, and the value it had in sort of this transition with sustainability. Coming out of this conference, I have much more clarity on the importance of ESG, and really importantly, governance that within big corporations that have a lot of the leverage power of large capital amounts, in order to see shifts in both environmental and social changes in those firms. We do need governance. We need the boards to be held accountable. And I think I might differ from Amit a little bit and lean more heavily on the side of the transition will occur more in the private sector than in the government space. So yeah, I came out a little bit clearer on ESG and the importance of it. So that was my biggest takeaway.
All right, well, thank you. And let's finish, Amit, with what's the silver lining that we might look forward to?
I think the silver lining is that there is clarity that both government and, like Ingrid said, private sector might have a role to play. We can disagree on which one has a bigger role to play and whether they'll be fast or slow. But I think the silver lining is there's a big transition happening. Investors are participating in a big way. And I think as the conference has shown, having academics and practitioners come together is useful to be able to clarify what the confusion and different elements that create confusion are versus where the pain points and things whether we want to push further need to be.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks so much, Ingrid, Amit, and on behalf of all of the colleagues here at Stanford University, until the next conference.
The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.